as I mentioned, I'm the former director of the Oxford course, present lecturer of the BPS. I had a great title for this talk, but then Rana and Ash came up with a much better hashtag for it, so I'm just going to change my title to the hashtag, which is Diversify ClinSci, which hopefully we'll see a bit more in the next coming months. So, I mean, I'm going to give you a fairly blunt presentation. Most of you, I would imagine, won't be surprised by a lot of what I'm going to say. Some of it I think you might be, because I think some of the information isn't available. A lot of the information has been available for a long time, which makes it even more shocking, really. But, you know, so just to, you know, we really have got a problem, which is on a scale that's you know, in terms of diversity and clinical psychology training, that's really, you know, on a scale, even though we're relatively small, but the extent of our diversity problem is probably bigger than any other, you know, profession, really, which is bizarre in a way. So who's to blame, you might be. And as I speak, I warn you in advance, I may well get emotional, I may well raise my voice, and you might think I'm blaming people, but if there was anyone to blame, you might think that a person who'd been involved in shortlisting and interviewing for 25 years, formerly member of CTCP, former DCP Director of Professional Standards, I think when this report came out I was DCP Director, former Chair of the BPS Professional Practice Board, former Director of a Programme, and the President-elect of the Society is probably more to blame than anyone else. So if there is anyone to blame in this room, you know, I'm more to blame than anybody else. So if you feel I'm blaming anybody, I'm blaming myself more than anyone. But of course these are systemic problems. And really I'm hoping that in this presentation I'll be looking more to look at the solution than to attribute blame. I mean, you know, I think we all hold, you know, we do need to take some blame, but this is very much trying to, and I will finish with some concrete recommendations, which you may well, you know, one of the benefits of not circulating this is that we may well, you may well point things out that I haven't thought of, and you know, those change. Just the first sort of little word about diversity. I mean, the way people talk about diversity sometimes is a bit like, I don't like gardening, it's not my thing at all, but I sometimes think about it as a bit like a gardener talking about, oh, we need a bit more of this colour, a bit more of this colour, and it'll look really perfect. And that's, you know, sometimes our view of diversity is very superficial, and we think about, you know, just you know, the sort of superficial part of it. But really, you know, as a gardener will know, there's no point just getting different plants together. They need, I know this much about gardening, that they need different kinds of soil and they need conditions to flourish. And you know, if we're talking about diversity, and I think Rana and Ash's presentation will talk more about flourishing and, you know, inclusion than I'm going to talk about. I'm going to focus mainly on, well, exclusively on admissions. But you know, just thinking about diversity in a superficial way is definitely not enough. So. What I'm going to focus on is admissions, and there's two aspects of admissions, which you know, I'm talking to admissions students, I don't need to teach grandmothers psychology, but sometimes we get confused, even in very sort of august circles, we get these things confused. One is representation, so in the people who are coming to our door, are they representative of the population that we're embedded in? And then, once they get to our door, to what extent are we including them? So what access? And sometimes we get those things confused, and I think for some reason which I'm not entirely clear about, we've focused a bit more on representation and inclusion. I'm using these in a specific way in this context, and I'll explain, you know, how I've sort of used these to generate some statistics. But I'd say, you know, we need both, because you can't include people if they're not at the table, but you need, you know, so you need representation, and then you also need inclusion, and then you come up with something approaching justice. So I'll start with talking about representation and clinical psychology training. So, I mean, if we talk about any representation of any particular demographic group, and it's an interesting thing, I don't know, I'll try not to give too many anecdotes, but this was a thing that happened to me about 5 years ago, that I did jury service. I don't know if any of you probably have done jury service, but I was in a room with, it was quite a big court, so there was a number of jury panels sitting, probably about 100 people. And because that's done with a random selection from the electoral roll, I sat there and I thought, this is the most representative group of people I've ever been in for a long time. I mean, look at the it's now, we're all psychologists for a start. We're not representative of the population in lots of ways, but you know, we're very rarely in a situation that is actually representative of the population, and that struck me as one example. If we want to know how representative of the population a particular grouping gathering that we're in is, this happens sometimes in these, I never know what they're doing. Is it...
Does the television need to go back on? Is that the problem?
Okay, so right. So what in a particular gathering, we need to know the proportion of well, in our case, applications, proportion of applicants from that particular group. And then, I mean, this is what we typically don't do actually with our, what we would expect. So the proportion from the specific group in the population, and that often varies with age. So we would look at an age cohort, and in some of the figures I present, I've used the census, which is the most, in terms of population, and used the 16 to 24 because it was carried out in 2011. So 16 to 24 is the right age cohort for us to use. And of course, lots of characteristics of diversity vary across the country, so we need to look at region as well. I'll show you that as I'm going through. So if we look at aspects of diversity, what we would want to look at to see if we're representative, obviously you'll be able to name all of 9 of the equality characteristics off the top of your head, I'm sure. I won't try you, but just to mention that we have access to all of, well, we don't at the point of selection, of course, but in terms of monitoring, we have access to 7 of those. The 2 we don't have is not currently monitored are gender reassignment and pregnancy, which when I was chair of the clearinghouse, I suggested we should be monitoring, particularly pregnancy. There are, of course, other aspects of diversity as well. Social class, economic wealth, region of the country is important in some things, family background, care history, whether the parents have been to university, refugee status, carer status, which we don't monitor. When people get to the point of applying for clinical psychology, it's obviously at the end of a fairly long process, which has various points that people could drop out of. Just talking to Sarah, actually, one of the good things is that people have already been through a process that's often looked at their diversity and looked at certain characteristics. At this point, UCAS have already collected information on people that apply to clinical psychology that theoretically we could access. So obviously, each year there's around about 18,000 full-time psychology graduates coming out with a psychology degree. We look for a 2-1 or a first, which reduces our pool. Then we look at people who want to pursue psychology. The conversion course, of course, is another route which does play an important role.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is that for all courses you're talking about now?
So I'm talking about the national, this is the national.
So we don't look for 2-1 or first, we don't look at degree class at all.
Okay. Oh, well, great.
So just to say there are exceptions.
Yeah, okay, great. Would like to pursue clinical psychology, and then we have experience requirements, and most courses have some sort of experience requirement. And then people who actually apply, shortlisted and accepted. So there are various points that people could drop out of this process. We tend to, when we're looking at how representative the people that we see are, we tend to compare people that we shortlist with people who apply, which is an important thing, inclusion, but not really in terms of representativeness. So if we just look at representativeness, I mean, I won't spend too long on some of these because I want to sort of focus on one particular thing, but one of the things we look at in representativeness is and the clearinghouse has pushed monitoring this, the area of the country in terms of participation. These are the polar postcodes that you'll be familiar with. They're not a measure of socioeconomic deprivation, and they're loosely correlated with that, but they are a measure of obviously access to participation in education, and they vary quite a lot around the country. If you look at London, there's very few areas of London with low, which are low on the lower ones to the more pinky ones, low on polar quintiles. So it's basically the population or the areas of the country divided into these 5 quintiles in terms of their participation rate. Whereas I just looked at one area randomly, but if you look where the clearinghouse is, you don't have to look very far for people who are coming from low polar areas all around there. So that does vary quite a lot around the country. so by definition, these are set up to represent people coming into higher education. So it's not any surprise at all that undergraduates, this is percentage of undergraduates by polar quintile, people in the, so these are equal amounts of the population, but less than 10% of people in polar 1 quintile living in that area access higher education. Whereas you'd expect, obviously, because they're equal areas, about 20% in each. If we look at our applications, actually, it mirrors pretty closely the distribution of people in undergraduate education. So actually, our issue of representation is clearly, obviously, at the undergraduate stage. There's not a significant difference. If we look at gender, obviously, again, if we look at gender across that sort of pathway, if you look at A-level students, you already see a gender disparity just if you look at people who take A-level exams. I got this from the Joint Qualifications Council. All these figures are available if you're interested. But so there's a gender disparity. The gender disparity is quite stark when you look at psychology A-level. So you get a sort of 3-to-1 ratio at psychology A-level. And at psychology undergraduate, we get this very even more marked disparity. So you've got less than 20% of the psychology undergraduate population is male, 81% female. That's the biggest gender bias in any degree subject other than nursing. And not surprisingly, our applications are sort of are pretty similar. They vary a little bit each year, but they're very similar to the undergraduate breakdown. I think a disparity of that nature in terms of it's certainly by far the biggest disparity in terms of representation is the gender disparity. So if we talk to, if you're looking about representation, the biggest those factors of men and low participation areas comes in before undergraduate. So any sort of initiatives to try and address those would clearly need to focus at that level. And obviously at that level, if you're talking about, and I'm not advocating for us to go into schools, that's daft. I mean, if you look at the number, I'll give you some figures of numbers of schools, there's about 3,000 schools in the country. There we need to obviously be collaborating with other people who have a similar aim about psychology, so working with undergraduate courses and other professions within psychology, other professional types of psychology. So in terms of representation, those issues come in early in the pipeline. If we look at ethnicity, so we start, as I say, this is the ONS data for the national census. For our purposes, it actually worked out quite well because these people are actually the people we're seeing now, more or less. 2011, you can see that people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds make up 15% of the UK population. If you include people from mixed race backgrounds, it goes up to 18%. I'm deliberately not including mixed race backgrounds when I'm talking about BME because, as you'll see later on, the outcomes are very different for people from mixed race backgrounds. So when I'm talking about BME, I'm talking about people that are classified under the ONS system as black, Asian or other. And that's the standard way of just defining it. But these, again, this is why it's important to look locally. This is the regional distribution of people from BME backgrounds, and as you can see, it varies really very dramatically across the country. It's not news to you. So in London, the proportion of people from BME backgrounds is over 35%, whereas in Wales, it's down below 5%. If you look, this is the other way of looking at it, of each population, people from black backgrounds, Asian backgrounds and other backgrounds, and this is where they live. The grey one is London. This is why it's unfortunate that no one's here from the London courses. So if you were doing, so in terms of the general population, nearly 60% of people who identify as from a black background live within the London region, in England, sorry, not the UK, and Asian and other. And so that's obviously, when you're looking at representativeness, obviously that's going to be a regional variation you're going to have to consider. So if we look at psychology undergraduates moving to the next stage of that process. So psychology undergraduates, actually the proportions are relatively similar, and overall, the proportion of BME people from identifying from BME backgrounds is higher than the general population for that age cohort. The people from identifying as Asian backgrounds is slightly lower than the general population. People identifying from black backgrounds is slightly higher than the general population. This is from HESA data that we collected when I was chair of the clearinghouse, which is available publicly on the clearinghouse website. So if we look at our applications, even if we just look at the raw figures, the overall, and this is, I've put years 2016 to 18 together for this, the intakes together for this graph. So if we just look at the overall figure, the BME rate is slightly lower than the general population, and the psychology undergraduates. But what you'll notice if you've been looking carefully at these graphs, that this distribution changes quite dramatically from, well, you can't see it here, but white other in the, so white other in the general population makes up 5%. If you look at our admissions, it makes up 20%. This is predominantly people from Ireland and other EU countries who are applicants to clinical psychology training. So these are people who are not there at in the general population at 1624, but are applying to clinical psychology training. So that skews the figures slightly. In fact, still even so, the proportion of from identifying as black backgrounds is still actually higher than overall. But if you look at the relative probabilities, now I've used this slide, but you told me not to, sorry. I didn't get a chance to change it. I thought it was easier to look at faces, but if I told you that so you can work out the relative probability of somebody in the general population applying to clinical psychology, and for the three groups, white, Asian and black. So if all you knew about somebody was they've made them the same gender, just because obviously there's the big gender disparity, but if all you knew about people was that they were, in this case I've made them all female, if they were female and you knew their ethnic background, what would you think their relative probability of applying for clinical psychology would be? That's a rhetorical question. But the least likely is someone from an Asian background, just slightly. So I've made one as the average for all three ethnic groups. Someone from an Asian background is very slightly lower than the mean for the pool put together. Somebody from white background, slightly lower than the mean put together. The person most likely, if all you knew about these people is someone from a black background, they're more likely to apply for clinical psychology training, more likely to do a psychology degree, and more likely to apply for psychology training, clinical psychology training, than someone from a white background, just based on the relative probabilities of people in the population. So, what we can say is that, and I've heard people say this in very sort of august settings, that we have a problem with representation of people from black and ethnic minorities, that people don't want to do clinical psychology training, and then coming up with explanations that might explain this, that to do, I mean, there are things wrong with the clinic, the curriculum does need decolonising and all that sort of stuff, but despite all these things, actually people from BME backgrounds as a whole are more likely to, or at least as likely as expected from the population, to apply for clinical psychology training. So the belief that people from black and ethnic minority groups are less likely to apply to clinical psychology training is a myth. And what's even more bizarre is it says quite clearly in Graham Turpin's report from 15 years ago that people from black and ethnic minority populations are overrepresented based on population statistics in applicants to clinical psychology programs. So, overall representation of black and ethnic minorities as expected from population data. Indeed, black applicants are actually slightly more likely to apply to clinical psychology than population statistics alone would predict. Again, hopefully this isn't news to you, but it's surprising how many, even program directors say, repeat this myth. And of course, what that causes us to do is focus in the wrong place, focus out there, when actually the problem is a lot more close to home. So, what's going wrong? Where's the issue coming? We've got relatively representative, and the representation, as I said, to Graham's report 15 years ago, we had a representative sample applying. Where's the problem? Well, it's not, I said to Sarah before, I'm certainly not blaming Sarah. But it's not before we get to the clearinghouse. But the clearinghouse does represent a roadblock for a number of applicants. On the clearinghouse, this is the headline figures of the success rate of applications. So this is last year, we had nearly 4,000 applicants. 594 people, I think, in the end got places on clinical psychology NHS-funded training courses. That's 1 in 6. So we need to remember the context of what we're talking about when we're talking about the application success. Most people aren't successful in their application. And just to put it in context, the success rate for undergraduate admissions to Oxford University is 17%. So our process is more competitive than undergraduate applications to Oxford University, who are doing a lot, as you surely know, about increasing access and participation. So if we look at inclusion, we need to look at the number of applications from a particular group divided by the total number of applications from that group, times 100, we get percent. There's two aspects to this inclusion, what I'm calling inclusion, of course. There's the bit that happens before we see them, the shortlisting phase, which of course, given the numbers that who apply, the vast majority of applicants only get as far as the shortlisting phase, and then the interview phase, the outcome of the interviews. And again, that if there is a disparity, knowing where it is obviously has an impact on what we might do about it. So if we look at access rates, I've just looked at a headline here, so I've actually combined those two previous things to just look at the overall success rate for these different groups. So if you look at gender, so the overall success rate is 15%. Gender, there's no difference basically. Sexuality, we record, these are very small numbers. In fact, I checked, I've only done these for 2018, so the numbers in sexuality are very small. In fact, if you looked at 2017, gay man would be 0%, which you think the complete opposite. So this is the problem we have, obviously, with small numbers. I should have really done this over a 5-year period, of course. Age, people 25 to 29 are slightly more likely, but still people are approaching 15% up to the 45 to 49 age group. So relatively, in terms of age, relatively not a significant disparity until you get to 45, 49, 50, 54. And again, these are smaller numbers as well. Disability, I forgot to mention disability when I was talking about representativeness. It's difficult to know in terms of, when I was with the Clearinghouse, we did some work to look at representativeness of our population in terms of disability. I think there's still a question mark there. I think there is still some more work to look at how representative is. Again, combining 16, 17, 18, so that's 3 years. So there does seem a slight, but still it's well above 10%, so it's about, whatever that is, about 13.5%. For quintile 1. So actually that's not massive in terms of discrepancy, and of course the above the average is quintile 5, which is just coming up to 20%. So where we start to, I'll take a drink of water now because I'm emotional. Where it starts to get much more stark is if we look at the success rate, the outcome for applicants based on ethnic background. So again, I've combined 3 years here, 16, 17, 18 intakes. People who declare their ethnic background as white British are approaching 20%, 18.5%. People who declare their background as mixed race, again actually above the average for the sample, 16%. Other down to whatever that is, just below 10%. Asian, 9%. Black, I think that's about 6.8% if I remember rightly. So that's the ratio between black and white British is about a third. So your chances are about a third if you the people from black backgrounds to white British backgrounds, which is shocking. I mean, I imagine you're shocked to see these figures. I'm sure you know these figures, but it is just. It's shocking to see them, particularly given that we know that people from a black background are overrepresented and have been since 15 years ago. So if you look at it even more starkly, So these are people, look, if we just look at the people who apply to our courses, almost 1 in 5 people from white British backgrounds are successful. 1 in 9 of the applications that come through our doors from Asian backgrounds, I've done it for shortlisting for interview, because this is where the big discrepancy comes. The discrepancies are not in interview outcome. So this is who are shortlisted for interview. So these are the people we even see. So people, in a sense, the people who say, "Oh, we don't see any black applicants," that's because you don't see them because you're not shortlisting them. So the people from black backgrounds, 1 in 13 applications from people from black backgrounds are shortlisted by UK clinical psychology courses. So were shortlisted between 16 and 18. That was 3 years.
Do you mind if I just comment there?
Application form. Just before we move on from these headline figures, one of the thoughts must be this is getting better. We've been talking about it, as we've discussed earlier. We've been talking about this for so long. It must be getting better. We're doing stuff about it. It must be getting better. No, it's not getting better at all. So this is the disparity between VME success rate and, I mean, both groups have been coming down as more people have been applying per place, but the difference, this goes back to 2007, the difference is pretty much exactly the same. This is all courses. So whatever we've been doing hasn't been working. I mean, I think you have to accept that. So actually,
I feel uncomfortable sitting here when you're saying that. When
yeah,
I
well,
think differently. I've got some slides with our figures on them.
Well, we're desperate for answers. If one course has got the answer, then we should be listening to that.
I think GMA testing is better than application forms.
I've got some data on putting them together, which we're all this. I mean, I'm just trying to highlight the problem, which hasn't got better as for the UK as a whole. And so we need to look anywhere we can for something that we can scale up and.
I can show you the figures later
Yeah.
on. But,
So this is the shortlisting rate for black applicants and white applicants. Again, going back to 2014, there's no difference. So
Representatively. Is that the actual numbers? Sorry.
that's the percentage shortlisted from black applicants and white British applicants overall shortlisting. So what are the solutions? I mean, there are solutions that people have tried, and I should actually take this opportunity actually to think I'm going to talk about the courses have tried solutions, and I think I want to give a lot of credit to the courses that have done things to try and address this, and there have been courses that have been trying to address this, and I think we need to give a lot of credit to those courses that have been trying things. And I'll talk about testing in a moment, but the first thing I'll talk about is outreach and mentoring, which a number of courses have done to try and support people prior to the point of application. This has happened on a more systematic way in the London area, as you know. CAP put some figures, or got some figures from Clearinghouse to look at the shortlisting rates, or success rate and shortlisting rates for applicants. Again, the blue line is white British, the orange line is BME applicants. The DCP mentoring scheme ran so that it would be expected to impact on 2016-2017 intakes particularly, but I think the data don't show any significant effect in terms of shortlisting rate, which I think I would say is not surprising, given that it's we're the same system, the structural system of shortlisting is the same. Providing mentoring has benefits, but it's if the problem is within the structure of shortlisting, it's not going to change that. Pre-interview tests we've talked about. Kathy's already mentioned a number of courses, and Lancaster one of the first courses to adopt pre-interview testing. And this was very much Graham's report. Says there are problems with using measures of academic attainment. Using graduate entry tests might well be considered. Of course, we're not the first people to do this, but some courses have really taken this up. I would, particularly this is widely used in medicine, as you'll know. I think it hasn't been successful in other disciplines. In terms of improving diversity, so other areas have moved away from this as a way of increasing diversity. So I think that might lead us to think it's probably not going to be the solution. So I've got some data for this presentation. All I've done, and the courses that use pre-selection tests, 11 courses gave me their data for, I've done 2014 to 2018. So again, I'm not deliberately not talking about individual courses, partly because of the numbers involved in individual courses make it difficult, but for this graph I've combined I've done courses that use pre-selection tests that year. So it starts at the 2014, I think it was 5 courses, and Lancaster being one, but I'm not talking about individual courses.
No,
And then by
asking what the tests were. Some use SJT.
Yeah,
and some
they use different
DNA
tests. Yep,
and they're
yep.
different predictive validity.
So I've bundled them all together. So
Well,
you can.
I wouldn't use an SJT because of the.
Yes, I've bunged them all together, so you can quite rightly say maybe there's some individual variation. So I've bunged all the courses using selection tests together. And I think you can agree, this is the white British is the solid line. And I mean, again, it's remarkably consistent, really, across these different ways of, different approaches. The dotted line is BME applicant shortlisting rate. If you compare that to the same time period for all the other courses, so the courses that weren't using selection tests, this is the blue line. So the blue solid line is the non-test courses, white British applicants, and the dotted line is BME applicants. In fact, there's some suggestion that the difference between them reduced, whereas the difference in the courses using testing was slightly greater. The numbers, I think what that tells me is that certainly testing as a whole can't possibly, it can't be the answer. It may, from this I can't say one course, it may be that there is within this some way of doing it, but as a whole, if we look at all the testing courses together, it's clearly not the answer.
I agree that not all testing suites aren't necessarily the answer, but if you look at the individual predictive validity of different types of tests,
This is,
make a difference.
I said I wasn't going to look at individual courses, but these are the 11 courses that use testing in 2018. This is the blue line is their shortlisting rate for white British applicants. The orange line is their shortlisting rate for BME applicants. And again, but given the small numbers, you'd expect a bit more, you'd expect quite a lot of variation because of they're quite small numbers, particularly when you look at like Cardiff course, for example. So I've obviously not identified them, but my eyeballing the data, how I haven't seen particular big differences between individual courses. I mean, you could, particularly if a course has been doing it for a long time, you could look at combining their data over a number of years. And that might be, something to do. But I haven't looked at this for, in thorough detail, but my brief eyeballing, I haven't seen significant differences in any one of the courses. So this is, I also did it, because I did it a different number of courses per year. I did it with the same 7 courses that use selection tests all the way through this period. So this isn't, so in the other one I started with 5 and ended with 11 courses. This one uses the same 7 courses all the way through, from 2015 this time to 2018. And again, may use slightly different types of testing. But again, it gets remarkably consistent. So the red line is the testing courses. It's remarkably consistent, the differences. So I've not seen any suggestion that testing, as a whole, the test courses that have been using it consistently have any difference in this disparity in shortlisting rates. I'm sure we can come back to this in the discussion. But from my looking at the data, I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that testing increases diversity at shortlisting stage.
Quite a few